Many worldgen features fill the world of Minecraft, from all types of trees to amethyst geodes and even simple things like underground ores. These features give each biome a unique appearance and resources to gather. But in custom worldgen, some features stand out above the rest for their ability to create robust and exciting visuals and environments, and perhaps the most powerful of all are the various types of patches. Let me explain. To understand what makes patch-like features so powerful, let's compare some other types of features you can find in the world. The ore feature type is not only responsible for iron, lapis, and other ore blocks that you might find in the world, but also all of the granite, diorite, andesite, and even large groups of dirt and gravel that you can find populating underground. It is an absolutely critical feature for custom worldgen, but primarily from a practical sense. When you're working with custom dimensions or custom biomes, it's important to include obviously things like ore blocks that generate underground so that there are resources for the player to gather while they're down here, but also the ore blobs for diorite, granite, andesite, or whatever other block you choose to include can help spice up and add a little bit more visual variety to the otherwise very gray or deeper underground dark gray caves, which is of course where ore blobs of tuff generate. However, just because these features are important and practical doesn't make them interesting. They aren't what really breathe life into a particular biome or region of the world. They aren't what makes them visually exciting. Most of that is left up to the surface. I've talked about trees before on this channel, and while they remain one of my favorite features, and they are extremely robust in terms of their configurability, they aren't necessarily powerful, even if they have a lot of both practical and visual applications. The giant pine trees that you see here in the old growth pine taiga, as well as the giant spruce trees, regular pine and spruce trees, and every other tree that you find in the game are all made with one feature, and the fact that you can combine all the different trunk types and sizes with all the various foliage types and configure many of them greatly to get all kinds of unique shapes and sizes is what makes them such a special feature. And yet despite this, there are features that are even more powerful than this. If you've ever explored the banks of a river, you might have wondered why all of the gravel, sand, and even often clay that generates in the shallow water here appears in the shape of a disc, and that's because these are actually made with a feature that happens to be called discs. Vanilla Minecraft uses the disc feature pretty sparingly, pretty much only for the dirt, gravel, sand, and clay that you find under shallow water in most non-river biomes. They have a lot of unique strengths and capabilities that are even now still continuing to be understood and explored, and they're definitely something I plan to talk about in a later video, but there is something that is more universally applicable and powerful compared to them. There are a few kinds of patches when it comes to Minecraft worldgen, but the most common one that you're going to encounter is the random patch feature. This is used for everything from the patches of short and tall grass and bushes that you can find in just about every biome, as well as specifically sunflower patches. Interestingly, regular patches that you find in most other biomes are done with something called a flower feature, as well as the patches of pumpkins that you can find in plains and forest type biomes or watermelons in the jungle, and much, much more. And while random patches are powerful in their own right, which we will explore in this video, the real power of patch-like features comes from vegetation patches, which are pretty much exclusively found in and used to populate the lush caves biome. Let's head into a flat world so we can see how both vegetation patches and random patches can be applied and where their real power comes from. I've set up a row of features here that we can use to explore and demonstrate how vanilla uses these features and in what ways they can be configured. So like I mentioned, the random patch, the most simple form of patch, is used for all kinds of things, including in vanilla Minecraft, the new short and tall dry grass that is used to populate deserts and badlands, along with everything else I mentioned before. It's also used for pumpkins, like I mentioned, as well as, if we were to set this to netherrack, the patches of fire that you find in the nether. So these features are not just confined to the overworld in terms of their application. Vegetation patches, like I mentioned, are used in the lush caves, but the moss patch feature is also what gets referenced and applied when you use bone meal on a block of moss. There are several differences between these two types of features, which we'll get into, but the first one that I'll mention here is their size differences. Random patches let you define an X and Z radius that is basically combined to act like a large square. So if we were to place even more random patches like this, then it would eventually fill up to create roughly a perfect square that is exactly the same size on both sides. Whereas the vegetation patch feature, if you use ranges, allows you to make rectangle shapes like this. You can get squares, this one looks pretty square-like, and that's just a matter of how the random number generator happens to stack up. Oftentimes you're going to end up with rectangles that are longer on one side than the other. Additionally, where random patches just place the thing that they are randomly placing, the vegetation patch feature first places a solid block of some kind, or any block rather, and then places the block or feature that you've designated on top of all those. The random patch feature isn't necessarily tied to any particular direction, but the vegetation patch is. It applies either to the floor, or if we set up a ceiling here, you can make a vegetation patch that applies to the ceiling, and that's how you get the moss and cave vines, glowberry vines, hanging from the ceiling in lush caves. So both of these are using the same feature, you just designate whether you want it to be on the floor or the ceiling. And then to look at the last type of patch-like feature, we first have to set up a little bit of random terrain here. I'm just using a random patch of stone to set this up, but then we can click this again and use a waterlogged vegetation patch. This is almost exactly the same as the regular vegetation patch. It lets you select a block state to serve as the ground and lets you place things on top of those blocks, but as you can see, it's also going to place a bunch of water. Specifically, the water is going to be the dominant block that it places, and then it's going to replace any valid blocks with that ground state, in this case clay, anywhere where the terrain changes in elevation. And it's going to try to fill any gaps that it can with water where there happens to be room. The other distinguishing factor is that the block or feature that you're placing as part of the vegetation patch or on top of the vegetation patch is only going to get placed in the water. You can't make it place on top of here. These are all the ways that Minecraft employs these patch-like features, but let's take a look at how they can be configured to create our own custom features. Starting with random patches, let's begin with the absolute basics. The random patch allows you to select a size, both horizontally on the X and Z axes, as well as a vertical range on the Y axis, and then you can define what to place. Most commonly in vanilla Minecraft, it's going to be a simple block feature, which lets you define a block state provider and essentially lets you place whatever block or groups of blocks you'd like. So here we only got a bunch of gold blocks, while my block state provider actually allows a small chance for diamond blocks to get placed. Since the random patch feature is being used to place what is technically an additional placed feature, you can use that to your advantage. We'll start by first placing a feature that replaces some of this grass with coarse dirt. That's just so that we can demonstrate that when I place a new simple block feature, I'm using glass this time instead of gold and diamond, but I've set it so that the simple block feature is being placed with a block predicate filter so that it can only get placed on top of grass blocks. I set up the coarse dirt beforehand, and now none of these glass blocks are on top of coarse dirt. They're not allowed to be placed there. Now, even though most of the time you're going to see simple blocks get used for random patches, they're not only limited to that. You can also use them to place block column features like this to add just a little bit more height variety to your terrain. In this case, we just have a very simple block column that first has a layer of 1, 2, 3 basalt, and then places on top a weighted state provider of either amethyst blocks or budding amethyst. And we can spread these around thanks to the random patch feature. It'll be different every time. You can use this for pretty much any feature, including trees, to create nice little bunches of trees if you want them to be placed relatively close to each other in small groups and then have a lot of space between them without needing to necessarily rely on noise. And all of these examples have just been using pretty much a flat area for the patch, but you can set the range so that it works in the air. Here is a group of end rods that create almost this like mystical feel as they are floating in the sky. They have an X and Z radius that's exactly the same as the Y radius to create what is technically a large square. If we were to place more of these, it would end up creating basically a cube of end rods. But when you restrict it to just one, then you end up with this almost kind of like glowing blob of end rods that again has that kind of mystical look and adds just a little bit more variety to the air of a biome. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe. I make all kinds of content related to worldgen, custom structures, and other data pack features that I'm excited to share with you. If you want to learn more about custom worldgen, I've written a very thorough guide for Datapack Hub, which you can find linked in the description. Worldgen is challenging, and it can be difficult to know where to get started. The goal of this guide is to be that starting point so that you can kick off and explore wherever else you'd like. While random patches can be used to create awesome shapes in the sky, and they do have applications on the ground, if you're wanting to have more control over the surface cover of a biome, the vegetation patch is the best bet. As I mentioned before, vegetation patches let you define a block state provider for the ground cover that they will replace, and you can also define which blocks they're allowed to replace as far as the ground and surface goes. They'll conform to the shape of the terrain if you give them the range to do so, and then on top of that, they can also place a feature, just like random patches. In this case, we're using a simple block feature, just like before, that has a weighted state provider for warped fungi, warped roots, and twisting vines, but you could just as easily include a huge warped fungus on this. This warped vegetation patch isn't used in vanilla, by the way. This quality of vegetation patch features of placing a block and then placing a feature on top of it is particularly useful for placing blocks that can't normally get placed on the ground cover that you have. For example, crops. I've seen a lot of packs that like to have wild wheat in particular generate in particular biomes because of their awesome and unique color and shape, but they can't be placed on top of grass even by worldgen, even though you can set block them to be. So placing farmland first with a vegetation patch that then places a simple block feature on top to place a variety of blocks is going to be your best bet. And you can even include water in the weighted state provider so the farmland gets irrigated. You may also notice that this crop vegetation patch feature has completely harsh edges, whereas this one over here has a little bit of bleeding into the surrounding grass. This is also configurable. When you set the X and Z radius for a vegetation patch, that's going to be the area that for sure 100% of the time is going to replace any valid blocks with the designated block state provider. But you can also set a random chance for additional blocks to get placed on the outer edge. It's only going to be up to 1 block distance from that starting zone, but it adds just a little bit more organic shape to the otherwise very square or rectangular vegetation patch. And you can include a random chance for additional blocks underneath the surface as well. Let's move on from regular vegetation patches and talk about waterlogged vegetation patches. So once again, like I mentioned before, when you place a waterlogged vegetation patch, even though it's going to replace the surface with sand, and you can even set the depth so that it's able to replace 1 block underneath the water with sand, it's only going to place the feature, in this case another simple block feature, in the water on top of that sand. It's not going to place it up here. However, I was lying before. There is a way around this. Let's place a couple of discs here so that we can get some more varied terrain in this otherwise flat world, and then place a waterlogged vegetation patch feature. Here I've set the ground state to mud, but you'll notice I have short grass, sugarcane, and moss patches on top of these blocks that are outside of the water. Because the vegetation patch, or waterlogged vegetation patch in this case, technically places placed features on top of each of those blocks, we can use this to our advantage so that we can utilize placement modifiers that otherwise wouldn't be available inside of a configured feature. So all this takes is a simple random offset placer that raises the feature 1 block up and then shifts it on the X and Z axes anywhere between -1 to +1 block away. You're not going to get coverage on every single block that's outside of water, but with a high enough frequency from something like account placement type, you can create some pretty serious cover. And since the lake feature type no longer supports water as a fluid reliably, this can be a great alternative to create really cool lakes and ponds on the surface that aren't filled with lava. Now through all of this, I've been using vegetation patch features that can replace grass and dirt, but you can set it so that they can replace whatever blocks you want, including as few as you want. So if we were to place, for example, a tree that is just a bunch of glowstone and has no foliage, this one is just a forking branch tree, then we can set a vegetation patch feature to only be able to replace glowstone, and that will allow us to then place more trees on top of that. The vegetation patch feature finds the highest glowstone that it can, and then on top of that, 100% of the time, places another glowstone tree feature. And we can repeat this any number of times. We just add more placed features to the feature list for this biome to create this really awesome branching glowstone tree. And just to show you that you can do this in basically one fell swoop during worldgen, here's another example. This takes us into the real power that vegetation patches hold. While they are very broadly applicable in very powerful ways to create more dynamic surface changes both for the floor and the ceiling, even though I didn't demonstrate that much here, this example here with the trees is a very basic demonstration of a concept that we call feature stacking. Again, because the vegetation patch feature places what is technically another placed feature, you can use other placement types, such as a high count, to create a spike-like shape like this that is otherwise very hard to recreate. This is a vegetation patch feature that is placing several fairly complicated block column features over and over and over again on the same spot above those dripstone blocks that it placed as the base. The code for this is essentially stolen from Incendium. They use this in the toxic heap biome, but instead of using dripstone blocks, they use a variety of concrete, slime blocks, and other appropriately themed blocks to create these awesome and much more dynamic shapes than what I'm doing here. But this is only possible because the vegetation patch feature allows us to basically designate an area and then place any number of features that we want on top of that area. And this can work across multiple features as well. This is just one feature, but if we were to first place a random patch feature that itself places several block column features going north, east, south, and west, then in normal worldgen, what we would do is have a vegetation patch feature that is at the maximum size and places exactly once in every single chunk of the biome that this feature generates in, that is only able to replace the stone bricks, mossy stone bricks, and cracked stone bricks. And then on top of that, places another block column feature to create this awesome, very organic maze out of ruins. You could do this with leaves to make a hedge maze, or just something similar to the crop feature that we made before, but with a lot of variety in the shape that the crops can be laid out in. So if we call this basically level 1 of feature stacking, where we have one feature that places several more features, and we call these ruins and the glowstone trees level 2 of feature stacking, where we place one feature and then a vegetation patch feature that's only able to replace the blocks from that feature. What would level 3 of feature stacking look like? Well, thanks to worldgen expert Apollo, we have that answer. By first placing some kind of a marker block in the sky, in this case I'm using red concrete, but typically you would use a leaf block so that it doesn't block certain height maps. Then you can place a vegetation patch feature that then places a feature that projects to a height map. So the vegetation patch is getting placed on the underside of this marker block, but it's placing a feature that gets moved over with a random offset and set to a height map to generate on the ground, in this case, this nice tall tree. And you can keep that marker block there and have another placed feature after that uses the same marker block to place a second feature, in this case a block column that stretches out to the east off of this tree. And you can do that again to get one on the west, on the north, potentially, and on the south. In this case I have a random chance, so we didn't get one on the north, so this tree is going to look slightly different than some other trees. And then that marker block is still there. We can add yet another feature to add, in this case, some small kind of bushes that use the cherry foliage provider to add some leaves to those branches and create a tree shape that would not be possible with a single feature. And then with one final vegetation patch feature, we remove that marker block like nothing ever happened. So that was one piece at a time. Let's take a look at it all at once. And look at that, we only got one branch here, but again, this is a shape, this is a tree that you would not be able to create with a single tree feature. This is expanding upon the capabilities of the tree feature and making it even more broadly applicable and useful. This is the real power of feature stacking, and particularly marker block feature stacking. Feature stacking like this is not very widely known, and that is the main reason that I wanted to make this video, because there are so many more applications than trees, which right now has been the main thing that worldgen experts have been using this for. Let's do another example here where we have, in this case, a white concrete block. Again, you should be using leaves for easier time with the height map, but I'm using a solid block just for visual purposes. And on that marker block, we'll place a vegetation patch feature that places a disc of podzol here, so that on top of that podzol, we can place a block column of red mushrooms on the east side, on the south side, on the north side, and on the west side. And then we place one more vegetation patch feature that all in one go does a mass replacement of some of the podzol to replace some of it with grass, and also gets rid of that marker block. And voila, we have a fairy ring, completely vanilla worldgen. And as we spawn it all at once to see how it looks and get all the different varieties and shapes that we can do, demonstrating that every single time we're getting that perfect circle of red mushrooms, I'll take this opportunity to mention that you may have heard the common tip that where you see patches of clay in swamps, there is very likely diamonds underneath them. This is largely a quirk and accident of vanilla Minecraft, but with feature stacking, you can make it intentional. So underneath this fairy ring, if you dig down, you're gonna end up finding some diamond ore. Only and exactly because I placed it as one of the features in the feature stack thanks to that marker block. Now, despite how powerful and awesome these are, and how much more room there is to explore their practical applications in worldgen, there are some limitations that we're aware of. For one, though this isn't a very good example because we're not doing actual world generation here, if you have multiple feature stacks in close proximity, and especially on chunk borders, it can cause some bleeding depending on what the features that they're actually placing are. In this case, you're not going to see it too terribly much, but because of the way that I'm handling the foliage that gets placed on those block column branches to the north, east, south, and west, I can end up getting a little bit extra foliage, some extra bushes on neighboring trees that technically have already had their feature stack completed. It's hard to really tell here. It's mostly going to come up for more sophisticated kinds of stacked features, but it can happen. It's something that sometimes has to be worked around. Additionally, both for vegetation patches generally, specifically ceiling vegetation patches, and also for stacked features, you often are going to need to use some kind of an environment scan placement type to get the feature in the right spot, or specifically to get the vegetation patch in the right spot. This is because while we do have inexpensive placement types for finding the floor performance-wise, environment scans are the only way that patches can find the ceiling. And so this is what the vegetation patches in lush caves use. They attempt to generate somewhere in the middle of the air first, and then they scan upwards to see if they can find the ceiling. But a lot of these kinds of placement types can really add up in terms of performance. And so if you're doing a lot of them for various kinds of placed features, it can stack up and not in a good way. However, more feature stacking tricks are being explored and discovered every day in the worldgen community, especially in the Stardust Labs Discord, which is a great place to go, an additional resource to go if you want to explore especially the very technical side of custom worldgen. If you've enjoyed the video, please remember to like and subscribe. Like I mentioned before, I make all kinds of content related to custom worldgen, jigsaw structures, and other data pack features. If you want to learn more about custom worldgen, that link is still in the description to check out my very thorough written guide with Datapack Hub. And you can join the Datapack Hub Discord, where I'm an official helper to get direct and personalized help and feedback from me. Thanks for watching!